Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Kristen. I'm Integro's webinar moderator. If you're new to Integro or our webinar series, hello and welcome. We do monthly webinars. We keep them 30 minutes, so they're short yet valuable for you guys. On the line with me today, I have David Starkweather. He's one of Integro's technical consultants. He's awesome. He has a plethora of knowledge on products and within the space, but today he's going to be focusing on auto classification for data cleanup. Before he gets started, I have a few quick notes for you guys. First, please ask questions. We love it when you guys ask questions, and you can ask those questions in the sidebar of GoToWebinar. Second, we have some poll questions for you guys today as well, and David will be getting those started here shortly. So without any further ado, I will let David take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for choosing to spend 30 minutes of your day with us today. I hope that you find this to be a worthwhile use of your time and that you get at least one piece of information that you can take back and use in your data cleanup efforts. So before we get started, I'd like to find out a little bit about who we have on the call today. So I'm going to ask Kristen to put up a quick poll here for us. And if you could just give me an approximation of your role within your organization, I'll try and make sure I don't bore you with information you already know.
Awesome. Well, the votes are coming in fast. Thank you, guys. We'll give it 10 more seconds or so to get your votes in.
Okay.
All right. Got most of the people in. I will close down this poll for you, David, and share the results. There you go.
Okay, so Kristen, I'm sorry, there we go. Okay, so it looks like we've got 35% records and information management, 4% legal, and 30% IT, and 30% other. All right, so I missed a category here. I'm kind of curious to see what those 30% other people are, but I'm glad to see that we've got a kind of a cross-functional mix, because if any of you have attempted to do data cleanup projects before, you know that all three of these roles, records, legal, and IT, is critical to get all three at the table and pulling in the same direction if you want to make progress on your data cleanup project. So if you're on the call and you haven't started, building bridges with those groups within your organization, I would highly encourage you to do so. It'll make your data cleanup projects go a lot easier. So if you're on this call, you probably already know the challenges of doing data cleanup in your organization. Most companies we work with are all trying to figure out the answer to the same questions. What is all this data we're storing? Do we need to keep any of it? Can we get rid of it? And the biggest challenge, of course, is identifying what the data actually is. In compounding the problem is that data is growing at a rate faster than we can manage it. And you guys are probably familiar with some of these statistics, but data volumes are doubling every 18 to 24 months, which makes it tough for the business to find what it needs. And I love this table here from the United Nations. They estimate that the global volume of electronic data will total 40 zettabytes in the next 2 years. And for those of you who might not know what a zettabyte is, that's 1 million petabytes or 1 billion terabytes. So a lot of electronic data that we're generating. Just a couple more stats you may be familiar with. It costs approximately $4 million annually to store 1 petabyte of information, and this is consuming IT budgets, of course. And e-discovery costs are averaging about $18,000 per gigabyte, and that ends up being, half the entire litigation budget in many companies. But if we're going to manage our data, we have to be able to classify it first. We have to know what it is. So I'm going to ask one more poll here. And what I'd like to know is, how much unmanaged data do you think you might have in your organization? And by unmanaged data, I mean data that is not classified and is not being managed by a retention period. So Kristen, if you could throw that up.
Yep, we are live. People are voting. Keep casting your votes, guys. We'll keep it open a bit longer for you. The results look interesting so far. All right, just a few more seconds, guys, and I will close the poll now. Sharing the results.
All right. So we've got a pretty good spread, almost a quarter of the people across all of our choices. So some of you obviously have a very manageable data cleanup project in front of you. Some of you that, the 13% of you that have 1,000 terabytes or more actually have a little bit longer road to travel, but that's okay. And 26 that don't know, that's typically an answer that our IT departments provide. So I'm going to assume that's the records management people or the legal people. I encourage you to reach out to your IT people and see if you can get your arms around what that number might be. Okay, so let's talk about manual classification for just a moment. So here at Integro, we have a team of governance professionals that do nothing but manually classify documents every day. And I'll explain why they do that in a little bit, but they can manually classify about 500 documents per day on average. If we're using some type of automated review tool, we might see a little bit higher numbers, but 500 is pretty typical. And in our work, we've also estimated that it takes about 3 million standard size office documents to make up 1 terabyte of information. So if you do the math on that, it's going to take 10 full-time employees over 2 years to manually classify just a single terabyte of information. And during that time it took them to classify that content, most medium-sized organizations will have accumulated another 100 terabytes of information. So you can see the impossibility of asking a team of humans to do this data cleanup work for us. So some of the benefits of auto classification, you can train the machine versus an army of people. You can also classify large volumes of legacy data in a pretty relatively short amount of time. With auto classification, you also obtain a lot more consistent classification results than if you're asking people to do it. And you can also leverage machine learning to help classify your day forward content. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. But let's take a quick look at what's involved with setting up auto classification to identify your content. And if you're thinking about doing an auto classification project, it's important to know, what it is exactly you're signing up for. So the first thing, obviously, that you need is a taxonomy to classify your content against. And for many people, this might be your records retention schedule, but it doesn't have to be necessarily. But how you define your taxonomy is going to play a very significant role in how much work you'll have to spend training the classification engine, and it will ultimately determine how successful your auto classification efforts will be. For example, if I were to ask you to place an object in the pink container in each of the 2 pictures, unless you struggle with color blindness, the buckets on the left are going to be much easier. There's just a lot more ambiguity in the teacups. So when you're creating your taxonomy, the key to achieving successful auto classification is to make your categories as mutually exclusive as possible. Now, typically this means that bigger bucket classification is better than very granular classifications. For example, an HR document is very different from a finance document, which is very different from an R&D document. But whether you decide to go big bucket or very granular, and I've seen both approaches work, you want to avoid overlapping and vague categories. So for example, on one of my first classification projects, we had several categories, but we had 2 that were very similar. One was called user manuals and one was called training guides. Now, I looked at the documents in both of those categories, and I had a very tough time distinguishing between the 2. So if it's going to require a lot of thinking and effort for a human to do the classification, it's going to require a lot more effort to train the machine to do that classification. Which brings us to the second most important piece of the classification process, which is training the machine. Now, regardless of which technology you choose to use, a big part of the process is going to be training the classification engine to recognize your content. And so it's important to remember that the classification engine is really only as smart as we teach it to be. So this means that we need to invest the time and the effort to thoroughly train the classification engine if we want to obtain credible results. And this is where we see a lot of companies struggle on their classification projects. So the way the classification engine gets trained is by feeding it sample documents that represent the category. Someone has to go out and find those representative training samples, validate them, and then submit them to the classification engine for learning. And a good rule of thumb is that you will need to gather at least 40 to 50 samples per category at a minimum. Now that number could be more depending upon how mutually exclusive your categories are or how many different document types you might have in each category, but 40 to 50 is a good starting point. Okay, I want to jump out of my presentation here for a minute, and I want to just show you one of the tools that we use in our classification projects just to give you an idea of what's involved. And this here is IBM's content classification product, and I'm in a section called the Classification Workbench. And the Classification Workbench is used to build what's called a knowledge base. And a knowledge base is just IBM's terminology for the brains behind the classification engine. This is where we come to train the classification engine to recognize your content. And so what we do is we take those representative samples that you provide, those 40 to 50 per category, and we import them in here associated with the category. So you can see down the left-hand side here, in this case, I'm classifying against a retention schedule. And you can see the number of items I have for each category. These are the number of representative samples. And so you can see there's a couple of categories here. I'm a little short in the number of samples, but it's a work in progress. And what we do is we import these samples into this classification workbench, and it goes out and it extracts information from these documents and builds basically a digital fingerprint, a mathematical representation, if you will, for each category. Okay? And so when it goes to classify against this category and brings in new documents, it compares the document, the fingerprint of the document it wants to classify versus the known mathematical fingerprint we have defined for the category in our knowledge base, and then it gives it a score, a classification score. And so when we're working here, when we import these documents, we automatically split your your content set in two. So half of the content set that you give us, those samples, go towards training the knowledge base. The other half goes towards testing the knowledge base. And it's important to hold documents back to test. If you were to train your knowledge base with all your samples, you'd really have no indication of how well your knowledge base is performing. And so if you give us 50 samples, 25 samples are going for training and 25 are going to testing. So you can see here, these are the actual documents here on the right in this main pane that I've imported into this interface, and they all belong to this BUS01 category. Now, I've ran the analysis against this, and you can see every other document here has a match score. Again, that's because I'm using my odd-numbered documents to train the knowledge base, and I'm using my even-numbered to test it. And so you can see this document here, the classification engine has a 99.86% certainty that this document belongs to the Business 01 category. So this document's digital fingerprint matches the fingerprint we have to the category pretty closely. So the classification engine has given it a very high score. You can see the next two documents also have very high scores. Those are the kind of documents we want to use to train our knowledge base. I get down here to this fourth document, and you can see the classification engine actually thinks that this document belongs to the Reg 03 category. And it has a pretty high percentage, 85% certainty that it belongs to that category, when I've already told it it belongs to the Business 01 category when I imported it. And now I've configured the tool here to basically take 5 guesses at what this document is. So I can look here, I've got match 2 and match 3. You can see in my top 5 matches, it didn't even guess the correct category of business 01. And it's less certain about its matching as it guesses over time. So when I'm tuning the knowledge base and trying to improve performance, this is one sample I would look at to see, why did the classification engine classify this towards Reg 03? Should it really be a Reg 03 document, or what's going on there? So that's the kind of work that we do when we're tuning the engine and trying to improve performance. And there's all kinds of great statistics you can gather and reports you can pull to help evaluate your knowledge base in this particular tool. There's one here called Knowledge Base Data Sheet that I use a lot. This tells me that I've got 24 categories in the knowledge base. I've got 620 items in my testing set. So I've got 1,240 in my total content set. Again, I'm using half to test and half to train with. But the number I'm really concerned about here is, how accurate is the classification engine in identifying the content? So I can see here on first guess, it's getting 72.9% of the items classified correctly. Now that's not a horrible score, but it's not great either. I'd want to see that score improve before we put this knowledge base into production. And you can see if I give the classification engine more guesses, if it has 5 guesses, it gets it right 90% of the time. So almost 90%. So I want to see these scores up here come down here to this first category, because when I'm using classification for data cleanup, I'm really only concerned about what this first score is. And so I want to see this score better than what it is right now. This report also shows me, how my categories are performing. I can see the categories that are performing well, and I can also see the categories that aren't performing so well. So when I come back and I start to work on this knowledge base and tune it some more, I'm going to focus in on these categories here that have the lowest category rating, that aren't performing as well as I would like them to. And the last thing that I see in this report is something called overlapping intents. And overlapping intents simply mean that there's similarities between the documents, and there's some ambiguity. And these overlapping intents really occur when our categories aren't mutually exclusive. So I told you earlier, it's really important to make your categories as mutually exclusive as possible. Otherwise, you get these overlapping intents. And what ends up happening is that categories are stealing classifications from one another because the categories have too many similarities between them. So a lot of your tuning of your knowledge base, your classification engine, is going to be trying to eliminate these overlapping intents and making your categories as distinct as possible. All right, I'm going to jump back into my presentation here. And so again, that is just one of the tools that we use on our data cleanup projects, but it's a very useful tool. But it's not just enough to have a tool that does the auto classification. The process that you use to do the cleanup in your organization will have a big impact on the results you achieve. And in fact, I would say without a good process in place, you may never get to a point where you can actually hit that delete key to remove the unneeded content in your organization. So this is a process that we use with a lot of our customers that works well. And we don't actually start with classification first. There's a lot of data cleanup that we can typically do before we run that classification process. There's really no reason to attempt to classify all your garbage. So the first step is to identify the rot, right? That redundant, outdated, trivial, transient information that you have in your organization. And common criteria that we use to clean up rot is that if a file hasn't been accessed in 10 years, or 7 years, or 5 years, whatever policy your organization and legal counsel is comfortable with, then it's potentially eligible for auto deletion. And sometimes we also include certain file types in our ROT definition, such as IT log files, or a lot of times we find personal files out there, music libraries, vacation photos, videos, things that aren't used for corporate purposes would also fall under our definition of ROT. But you can't just delete the ROT. You have to ensure that this data is not subject to any type of legal hold prior to deletion. So it's critical that you have a proven legal hold process in place, or that you do a review of the ROT prior to deletion so that you don't inadvertently delete something that you must keep for a legal matter. The next step we typically do is to identify sensitive information in your organization. Personally identifiable information, or PII, includes things like social security numbers, credit card numbers, W-2s, salary information. And this kind of information is not typically stored out on file shares or in email due to security concerns, and it should be remediated per your company policy. Once you've removed the ROT and remediated the sensitive data, then you can start using auto-classification to identify your records. And the less data you have to classify, the faster it goes. So once you identify those records, then they can be moved to a records repository, or at least retained and disposed of according to your corporate records retention schedule. So here are some scorecards from one of our more recent data cleanup projects where we use this approach. In this project, we were evaluating unstructured data on the file shares for a financial services company, and we discovered that 70% of their content hadn't been modified in over 5 years, and that was their definition of ROT. If it hadn't been modified in 5 years, it was considered ROT. They also assured us that they didn't have any PII stored on their file shares. They had gone through a big cleanup effort to remove their PII, but when we ran our tools against it, we still found over 6,000 documents that contained social security numbers. So they were fairly surprised to find that many out there, out in the wild still. And then once we isolated the ROT and the PII, then we applied the auto classification categories, based on their corporate records retention schedule. And so you can see here just, the number of records we found in each category as we went through and applied the auto classification. So once you've done your data cleanup, you want to make sure you can maintain this state going forward, right? And this can be a challenge as well. I get tired of cleaning out my garage every fall because I haven't taken the time to organize things as they come into the house. And so here's just a few quick ideas for implementing good information governance on a go-forward basis. A lot of you are probably already practicing these, but simplify your taxonomy wherever possible. We see a lot of companies trying to reduce the number of categories in their records retention schedule, doing away with event-based retention where possible. And this makes it, it makes it a lot easier to administer and actually do disposition of content. And it also makes it a lot easier for end users. If they have to choose from fewer, bigger bucket categories, they're more likely to adhere to the policy. Second, have an active records and information management program. Obviously, we have a lot of records managers on the call today, so I know that's in place. Obviously, active is the key word there. It's not enough to have the policy, but you really need to make sure that it's being implemented and acted upon. And a lot of times that involves and requires having IT systems that help enforce the policy. We really need to give our users the tools that they need to be compliant with our RIM policies. And then lastly, we want to leverage the classification model for go-forward applications. So you've taken this time to use auto-classification. You've invested in the training of the knowledge base. You've made it smart to recognize your content. You've used it to clean up your legacy data. Now take that classification model and apply it to your go-forward content. You can apply it to email. I've seen it applied to scan and capture applications. You can really apply it to any type of document repository to classify things as they're coming in, whether it be file share, SharePoint, Box, or different ECM repositories. But this is just one quick example of that. Integro has a product that does auto-classification of email as it hits the inbox. So as soon as it comes into the organization, we're leveraging auto-classification engine to help users decide what they need to keep and what they can get rid of. And if you haven't seen that product, give us a call, or you can check it out. We've got some videos on our website if that's something that's interesting to you. But that's just one example where you can leverage that auto-classification model for your go-forward content. Now, I've mentioned earlier that Integro has a team of governance professionals that does manual classification of documents. And what we found is that a lot of our customers don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they don't have the skill sets, or really even the desire to train the classification engine. And because that's such a critical step in achieving success with auto-classification, we've got a tagging service where we come in and help you identify those training samples and then train the classification engine. So if that's something you're struggling with or need help with, please do reach out to us. This is something we're doing every day for our customers. And it doesn't have to be just records that we classify. We can use the tools to find and classify things such as contracts or intellectual property or any other content types that we train the engine to recognize. And another great use case for classification, if you're using it, is in the process of migrating data to the cloud. If you're doing that, auto-classification can really help you figure out what you need to keep and what you can leave behind. I would urge you, don't move your garbage to the cloud, because once it's there, it's going to be very difficult for you to clean up. So if I could leave you with just three things, it would be, first, don't shortchange the process of training the classification engine. Train your classification engine to be smart. You'll be much happier with the results. Second, tag the important things you need to keep and get rid of the rest, if it's not subject to a legal hold, of course. And then finally, use the auto-classification tools as one of the tools in your toolbox to eliminate massive amounts of risk, cost, and noise in your environment. Reduce those hundreds of terabytes that I know you're storing to just tens of terabytes. And if you can do that, you'll be able to declare your data cleanup project an overwhelming success. So that's all that I've got today. I really appreciate you joining. Thank you for your time. I hope it was worthwhile. I'm going to turn this back over to Kristen now.
Awesome, David. Thank you. That was fantastic. Guys, we're going to do some questions. I do know that we're almost at the 30-minute mark, so if you have to drop off, that's totally fine. This is being recorded, so feel free to reach out to myself, and I can send you the recording or a copy of the slide deck, what have you. But for those that are able, David will be online to answer some questions now. First question for you, David. What type of documents can the tool classify? PDFs, Word docs, etc.?
Yeah, so it can most classification engines can classify almost any type of Microsoft Word document. We also classify email with it pretty consistently. I will say documents are a little bit easier to classify than email. Email is the most unstructured of the unstructured data types, and so it takes a little more effort to train the knowledge base. Documents that are very have very clear formats, such as forms, like tax documents, for example. W-2s don't change from year to year, and they look very much the same. We really don't need 40 to 50 tax documents to train a classification engine, but again, documents that have very concrete forms or have a lot of repeating language, Contracts are another great example. There's a lot of verbiage in contracts that repeat. Those types of documents are very easy for the classification engine to work with, but again, really almost any type of unstructured data the classification engine can read and classify.
Awesome. Next question for you. What is the typical time frame for training the classification engine?
That's a great question, and I don't know if there is a typical time. I can say that that's going to depend on several factors. One is, how many categories do you have? 2, how mutually exclusive are those categories? And 3, how many document types do you typically see in each of those categories? Those are all things that are going to have a factor in how long it takes you to train the knowledge base. I can give you a couple of examples. I have one customer that has 19 record categories in their retention schedule. They've done a lot of great work to simplify their taxonomy. And I think the training effort there, is probably about a month in duration. So that was a fairly quick training effort. We also have customers that have upwards of 200 record categories in their retention schedule that are used in classification, and I can say that they've spent close to a year's time training the classification engine to recognize their content.
Awesome. One more question for you. One of the attendees was talking about how you identify rot, and they mentioned it's also important to be aware of what kind of document it is, who owns it, and the retention period. I was wondering if you would want to elaborate more on rot and how to find and delete that.
So typically we encourage our customers to come up with policies that define their rot that will be applied across the organization versus kind of handpicking, and reviewing documents and sending them for people to review. We find that if you send documents for people to review and say, hey, we think this is eligible for deletion, can you review and make sure that, everything's okay? We never get to the point where we're actually hitting the delete key because there's just too many delays. People don't have time to review the mass amounts of quantities of information. So we really do encourage a policy-driven approach, and maybe that's more than 10 years. Maybe it's longer than your longest retention schedule, assuming you don't have schedules that are permanent. But yes, there are some documents that, especially in highly sensitive areas of the organization, you might need to do some manual review of and send them to people to make sure that, they've reached their retention period. You can apply the auto classification tool to your content before you identify the rot. So you could take a stab at identifying the records first and then going after your rot. That's certainly a valid approach. It just takes a lot longer for the auto classification process to run if you have to classify all of your content and not just a smaller subset. So it just takes a little bit longer, but that's certainly doable as well. So, Kristen, I don't know if I answered the question, if there was a question there, but hopefully that's helpful.
Well, that was great. Yeah, thank you, David. That is all of the questions that we have for you, David. I will let you wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. David, any final words?
All right. Yeah, again, thank you, everyone, for your time today. Again, I hope it was worthwhile. I think Kristen sent out a survey. Please let us know how we did, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thanks a lot.